Welcome to the Paths of Rhythm podcast with me, Adam Gow. Formerly the One to DJ podcast, it's a show which looks at how a passion for music shapes our lives. On the show I speak to DJs, producers, writers, photographers and anyone else who contributes to the culture to learn about the good, the bad and the ugly of where a mutual labour of love has taken them. Welcome to Paths of Rhythm, everyone. We're back here with something a bit different today with a sound engineer. Not only any sound engineer, but a legendary sound engineer who's worked with the likes of KRS-One, Gravediggaz, Prince Paul, De La Soul, Medeski Martin Wood, and many others. Scotty Hard, how are you doing today?
I'm well, thank you.
Excellent. So, yeah, really looking forward to getting into some different things, particularly around hip-hop engineering, hip-hop production, things like that,
Sure.
and also your journey. So, do you just want to start by talking about where you grew up and what your earliest musical memories are?
Well, I grew up in Vancouver, BC, and started by playing, learning guitar as a preteen, I guess, and sort of was obsessed with that for many years. And then I went to music school and studied classical composition, classical guitar, and jazz as well, and played in a whole bunch of bands at the same time while I was in music school. Went to music school for 2 years after I got out of high school, Vancouver Community College, and took sort of a hybrid courses of jazz and classical, but was a classical major because I just thought studying jazz at a college was pretty fucking jive. So, and I was, pretty into that contemporary classical music.
So what sort of artists?
Louis Andriessen and Frederick Rzewski and Steve Reich and big John Cage was a big influence, and also into all the big 20th century masters like Bartók and Stravinsky and then Xenakis and Ligeti and all that kind of stuff. So that was kind of my path for a while, and then I kind of got bit, but all the while I was playing in sort of underground alternative bands. One was sort of a punk funk kind of band called Rhythm Mission that was like very New York, kind of a cross between the Contortions and Pere Ubu a little bit, and then influenced by sort of the harmonic funk stuff of Ornette Coleman, who we opened for him in 1982 actually, and got booed by all the jazz people in Vancouver. All the free jazz guys, crusty free jazz guys, thought that they should have that gig, and Ornette's management at the time said, "No, we want a rock band, or we don't want a jazz band." So that, led me down another path, and James Blood Ulmer and all the sort of no wave music that was coming out of New York in the early 80s, like DNA and the Contortions and Defunct and all that kind of stuff. And so I was always looking to New York City as a and being also as a youngster was very really into jazz, and Charlie Parker and Miles Davis is a huge influence, and all his kind of music that he did. So, New York always seemed to be sort of I guess in the back of my mind, always a destination. And then when I heard It Takes a Nation of Millions by Public Enemy, I was just like, all right, yep, I'm going. I got to go there. I got to be part of this, So,
so in terms of jazz then, like, how old were you when you got bit by the jazz bug in classical? Because that's quite different and quite complex stuff to get into if you're young.
I was in my mid-teens, I guess. I kind of got interested in playing jazz and went to a jazz camp. And, I was a terrible jazz guitar player. I finally gave it up once I was playing in New York with real good jazz musicians and sitting there going, "Do you have a chart? I could do it if you got a chart." And
was it all like modal stuff then?
No, just like post bebop kind of stuff. And I played in a jump swing. One of the other bands I was in Vancouver was called the Jazzmanian Devils, and we did sort of jump swing. Almost, we started out as kind of a little weird avant-garde sort of punk jazz kind of group, and then the leader of the band got bitten by the Louis Jordan bug, and we started playing all his songs and almost became kind of a Louis Jordan tribute band. And but because he was reading a book, and the guy, a history of R&B or something, and the interviewer asked James Brown who his biggest influence was, and James Brown said Louis Jordan. So we immediately just bought every Louis Jordan record, and the one that we kind of modeled our sound after was one that was actually produced by Quincy Jones, of all people, and featured this guitar player named Mickey Baker, who I had known just from being a guitar geek, and he had written some guitar instructional books. But Mickey and Sylvia was a famous group from the early 60s, late 50s. Anyway, Mickey Baker was in the Louis Jordan band, and they made this one record. I don't even know what it's called. I mean, just Louis Jordan and his Timpani 5 featuring Mickey Baker, maybe. But like, it had all the classic Louis Jordan arrangements, but with all these like sort of T-Bone Walker, Chuck Berry riffs in between all the horn lines.
Right.
So that was kind of like the sound that we were modeling ourselves after. And then, then I got, I was really pretty obsessed with contemporary classical music as well. And I mean, that's the thing with Vancouver is like, I went to every punk rock show, every like experimental music show, every jazz show, and you could like from the age of 17 to 24 or something until I moved to New York, because in Vancouver you could go to every show. In New York, there's that amount of shows every night, pretty much. So, I could really absorb all these disparate things, and I think at the time, it was unusual for somebody to be into all that kind of music. Whereas nowadays I meet kids, music school kids and younger kids, and they wouldn't be unusual for a guy to know, Stravinsky, Albert Ayler, and the Sex Pistols or.
Yeah.
But back then, 40 years ago, nobody was like I was, all the guys were jazz. The jazz guys were the jazz guys, and the classical guys were the classical guys. And none of them were rock guys. So I was kind of doing all that stuff at the same time. And then I moved to, and I had sort of started to learn how to record. And I had an opportunity to move to New York. That a guy who was in kind of a famous Vancouver kind of punk new wave band called the Pointed Sticks. I knew he was a friend of mine, and he had moved to New York on the behest of another Vancouver guy who was engineering at Calliope Studios, which is the studio where basically the home base for the native tongues, De La, Stetsasonic, Latifah. All those early records were done there, and they, were always looking for engineers to come and, they had a 24-hour studio. So, you go, and Bill Hemme, this guy from the Pointed Sticks, Bob said, we need another engineer. And Bill went out there for a year, out here for a year, and then went back to Vancouver, and I was doing some recording projects with him. And he said, I said, I'm interested in moving to New York. And he said, well, yeah, I'll connect you with the guys. And, I called the guys at Calliope from Vancouver, wow, long distance phone call. And they were like, oh, we love Canadians. Sure, come on out. I mean, we can't guarantee you any work, but, come out and see what happens. And I came out and was palling around with Bob Coulter, and he was working at Chung King House of Metal a lot. So my first job was there.
When you moved to New York then, what level of engineer, were you like tape op, or were you doing sort of like a lot of the...
There was no such thing back then. I mean, I basically just learned. I was in a band, sort of not a prog rock, like a band it was fronted by a woman who was a violinist singer, and it was kind of a bit like Kate Bush, Jane Siberry, that kind of music. And she had a studio in her basement, and we made the record in the basement, and the guy who was producing it was her boyfriend, sort of ex-boyfriend. And I was just there all the time and was just looking over his shoulder, asking a few stupid questions here and there. And he said, "Oh, we need kind of like an ambient instrumental kind of thing for the end of the record." And she, Denise said, "Oh, Scott's got this idea," and she played him this little cassette demo that I had made, like in her basement one night when I was stoned. And he's like, "Perfect, that's great." So I call him up. I'm like, "Hey, when are we going to record, my song?" And he goes, "I'm not going to record it. You're going to record it." So that was the beginning of me jumping in the pool at the deep end by myself. And, I pretty much, would put the tape machine in, record, run out to the 20 seconds pre-roll, run out to the tracking room, play the guitar. I had a bunch of handbells. I played handbells. I played keyboards, and just and anyone else that we needed to play on it. I think the keyboard player came in, and I recorded Denise's violin. And, I just sort of learned by the skin of my teeth. And then, some other friends in Vancouver gave me the keys to their studio one summer. And, the guy showed me a few rudimentary things about editing tape. But I pretty much, was just bullshitting my way through everything. And I, on the level of stuff I was doing in Vancouver, it was fine. I kind of, recorded my own band a little bit and a few other little side projects, dance projects for the keyboard player in the band. And then I just came out to New York, and I think my first session at Chungking came in, and it was with Tone Loc, and it was for the 1-900 tone phone, for like an ad where everybody had these 900 numbers, which is the sort of genesis of the Mark the 45 King song, the 900 number, because that was a thing back then, is the 900 numbers. And he comes in a full-length mink coat. It was like January of 1989, and they're like, "Oh, let Scotty do this session, the new kid," and because they figured it would be easy. And some guy who was a producer at MTV was going to be the sort of producer of the session. And he came in with the instrumental for, I always say it was Wild Thing, but I was been corrected, and somebody said, no, it was the Funky Cold Medina. But they were kind of very similar. Anyway, the song started with eight bars of drum machine, and then boom, 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 bam, 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 that. And the guy just comes in with the 12-inch and says, "Here, just record this down. We'll do it, the voiceover over the track, but just, edit out those 4 bars of drums." I'm like, "Yeah, sure, no problem. I do it all the. Why don't you guys go get a cup of coffee and I'll come back." And I was just like, I'd never edited 2-inch tape before in my life. So, and it turns out, in retrospect and thinking back, and I made the marks on the tape off the wrong head. But the in and the out point they're both on the wrong head, so it ended up being fine. And I pushed play just as a guy, just to check it, just as a guy walked back in the room, and it went bam, bam, boom, 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 and I was like, whew, "Oh my God, that was right." And that's like, who knows, if I'd made that edit wrong, maybe I wouldn't be here today. But that was the beginning of. That was the beginning of the bullshitting my way through everything. And I mean, I still don't consider myself an engineer. I'm able to navigate those. I've been able to figure out how to do this for 30 years because I'm a musician, and I just rely on my musical instincts to kind of get me through the day. But I really have very little knowledge of ohms and outputs and all that kind of stuff. It's I just and there's a lot of people And I would say most guys that I know who are engineers used to be in a band, and it's always the one guy in the band who knows which end of the mic cable goes into the microphone. That guy ends up being an engineer.
Yeah, I mean, Bob Power's the one that you tend to hear a lot about in terms of hip hop, isn't he? And like he was in bands and stuff.
Yeah, well, Bob and I started out both at Calliope. I know Bob from back then.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. Bob was the Tribe Called Quest guy, and Bob Coulter was the Stetsasonic guy, and I became the Prince Paul guy.
So how did that relationship start?
Uh, they were doing De La Soul is Dead, and Paul's very loyal to his friends to this very day. But even back then, and he had hired his friend Mike Toluxing to engineer the De La record and that album, and he didn't show up for work one day. So, typical as in Calliope, someone called me, and I had probably worked a midnight shift before. I probably had only been asleep for a couple hours, and the phone rings, and they're like, "You got to get up here." And I'm like, "Okay," and I walk into the De La Soul's Dead session, and everybody's sitting around, and they're like, "Yeah, loop this up. Yeah, now put it backwards. Now do this. Now do that." And it was just, I mean, it's funny you hear these podcasts. I've even heard some of the Questlove ones like, "Oh, wasn't it amazing? Like this, working with this guy, that or that guy." There's not me being interviewed, but other people. And it's like, they didn't choose that guy. It's just at Calliope. It was just whoever showed up, and there was little notes on the track sheet of what BPM it was. And, there was sort of a little system of how to because you had to make beats for people. People came in with a record, or sometimes not even a record. They would just be like, I'm like, "All right, what are we doing today?" And they're like, "I don't know. We got this song. It's called this." And I'm like, "Okay, what's the music?" And they're like, "Well, that's that's for you to sort out." I'm like, "What?" And they're like, "What kind of tempo, or what kind of what kind of thing are you looking for?" And I remember doing this one session. The guy's like, "Well, I'll know it when I hear it." And I'm like, "Oh, that's the fucking kiss of death." Like, you're just scrambling around, programming drums, trying to find something. I mean, at least if somebody brings a record in, you've got a starting point. Some old record from their dad's record collection, and you catch the beat off of it, and then you just start building off that. But when people come in with absolutely nothing, with the "I'll know it when I see it" attitude, that's like, "Oh, here we go." So there was a lot of that. There was a lot of, but anyway, Paul and I, I just did that session and connected with them, and I had been working a lot with the Jungle Brothers before that. Or with Africa, he was doing a lot of solo stuff, and then he had been on I guess G Street Records, which is a British label, had released their first record, and they maybe did a tour or something, and they knew the British guys who ran the label, and the Stereo MCs were making their second record, and they wanted to do it in New York, and they called Africa and said, who do you recommend? And he said, "This guy Scotty." So that's where I did that record, Supernatural, with the Stereo MCs, and the first ever PM Dawn session came out of that recording. And then I just gravitated into working with Paul. I didn't finish. I think I did 2 days on De La Soul is Dead, and then for his next project was this group called Resident Alien. He had his own label by then, and Resident were just friends of his, old high school friends of his from Long Island, and he hired me to do that record, and then pretty much after that, I did almost every record with him.
So, in those sessions when you were working with Paul, for example, when people were bringing you the records and stuff, were you then having to work in drum machines, or were you doing everything on tape?
Well, both. Basically, everything that came out of Calliope in that era was made with an SP12 drum machine, synced to 24-track tape with SMPTE, and with an S900 drum machine, which has, I think, 11 seconds of sampling time at
Yeah.
maximum bit rate. So you could maybe get 2 loops, and you'd line them up and drop those on tape, and then you'd turn the sampler on and off and clear the memory and sample the next thing they came in, or do set up the scratches, or do vocals, or add some 808 kicks and some snares and stuff. So it was a combination of a lot of things. Well, not a lot of things, a combination of a few very simple things: tape, SP12, and the 900.
So coming from your background of sort of jazz and classical rather than electronic, was it a big thing trying to get your head around those machines?
Well, I had learned I had learned how to program like a Yamaha drum machine back in Vancouver, and
Right.
experimented a little bit with we did a new music class in at music school, where I did a little electronic project, and I've always it's always just engineering and programming, and making beats has always come pretty easily to me. I mean, it just seems like a very simple thing, but evidently it's not, because everybody isn't able to do it. But and I'm not like the total techno whiz, as you probably figured out by me trying to stumbling around trying to log into your podcast. But I basically, my philosophy is like, just learn all you need to do to learn how to make a track, and then start making music. And then if you need to figure something that you want, if your mind or your creativity gets to the point where, like, wow, I wonder if it can do this, that's when you pull out the manual, or you ask someone, hey, do you think it can do this? Or you just do something really weird with the technology. But I was in a band with a guy, and like, he bought this new keyboard, and I'm like, hey man, have you used the new keyboard yet? He goes, well, I haven't finished reading the manual. And I'm like, what? Just turn the fucking thing on and start playing, man. Like, I guess that's my philosophy.
Yeah. So what was that relationship? So say with Paul, for example, I mean, you could apply it to any producer really, but how much with an engineer and in that era and stuff, how much of it is you just doing what you're told versus you having a creative and a sonic sort of input on how the music sounds?
Well, it totally depends on your relationship with those people. I know that when I started working with Paul, he had mentioned that he had been working with another engineer who shall remain nameless, from the Calliope cast of characters, and that guy had just produced a record that was kind of getting some buzz, and Paul went in to do a session with him, and he said, oh, you should do this and you should do that. And he didn't take kindly to that. So I kind of knew that my role, when working with him, or working with, if you're they're pretty clearly defined roles. But at a certain point, like, I don't know if you listen to any music by that guy Ka, but I made a whole bunch of records with him, and he pretty much, and I just mixed all those records, but he basically was just like, the last record I did with him, he was had some family issues and stuff, and I was there mixing by myself a lot, and he's like, but previously he had always come to all the mix sessions, and I was like, yeah, man, are you going to come to the next mix? And he's like, well, you're killing these mixes, man. I don't know if I want to come and fuck up your flow or anything. And I'm like, man, no, come and hang out. But like, so sometimes I was sort of I had an assistant around that time, and I was telling, like, trying to tell them, like, because they would say stuff to me, and I'm like, I'd really prefer you not to, give your opinion unless it's asked for. And he goes, well, the guy in the band asked me what I thought. And I'm like, okay, well, just tell him it sounds great. But, uh, and I said, I said, I don't even like to talk when when I'm not producing a session. And he's like, well, what about with Ka? And I'm like, well, yeah, I've made like 7 records with that guy. So at this point, like a lot of what I would do sonically and stuff is sort of become part of the sound. But, those are sort of rare, reasonably rarefied. It depends. Like, well, for instance, like Medeski Martin Wood, like those records are very much me, because I had they wanted that sort of hip hop sound. They wanted my creative input. Some people really, and at this point in my career, that's pretty much why people call and ask me stuff. I mean, I was working with Paul recently, and we were doing something, and we were doing vocals with this guy, and I said, "Oh, what about it?" And then I kind of stopped myself, and Paul's like, "No, what were you going to say?" And I was like, "Oh, this and that." And he goes, "Yeah, no, that's a good idea." And he just to talk back and tells the guy, "Yeah, do this."
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so it's you get to a point in your career where you have a bit of a little bit of freedom to kind of do things and express things. But like I don't really do sessions that much anymore. But if some big name guy came and asked me to come and engineer a session for them, I would just do that. I would just be the engineer, and and they said, well, what do you think? And I'm like, well, why don't we try this or this or this? But sort of all there's you have to find a certain sort of comfort zone with every different artist that you work with.
Yeah. Do you think over the years you work out better when to shut up? Because I've had jobs where I've gone in and I've either tried to sound like I know more than what I know, or I've made a suggestion when I just should have shut up, and I've been basically told that, and it doesn't feel good at the time, but it's a lesson.
Yeah, it is. It's a lesson, and I think I learned that fairly early on, so that I always had a pretty good sense of what was appropriate and what wasn't, and when to lend an opinion and when not to. Because the thing is, like, there's a general distrust of engineers from artists.
Hmm.
So, you're kind of working against that for a certain length of time with your relationship with those people. So you've kind of got to win them over at a certain point with it, showing them that I'm here because I like your music and I trust you, and I hope I'm here because you trust me. But sometimes you're in a situation where there is no relationship or there is no long-term thing. You're there for one day or something like that, and then
Yeah, like it's a gig basically. Turn up, do your thing, go.
yeah. And like I said, I'm kind of past all that. I pretty much do my own music now. And I mean, I actually did a session on Sunday for a friend of a friend, and someone was like, "Oh, do you do that very much?" I'm like, "No, hardly ever." But my friend asked me to do it, and then I spoke to the guy, and I was like, it was obvious from 5 seconds in that the guy knew what he was doing, and he was a professional. And I thought this will be fairly easy. It won't be like, oh my God, I can't believe working with people who just have never made a record before or something. It's like I can't. It's hard to go back to that.
Yeah, yeah.
The midnight Calliope shifts were that, like working with people who just didn't know what the fuck they were doing, and and they're paying their $35 an hour to record their stuff. So that that was a long time ago, but I learned a lot from doing all that kind of stuff.
Is there anything that you worked on at the time that you kind of didn't think much of that then blew up?
I mean, the biggest record I ever did, even to this day, probably is I work with 45 King on a remix of "Been Around the World" by Lisa Stansfield, And that was already I don't know if I had even heard it on the radio by that time, but it became huge. But I mean, this remix was like 11 minutes long. And I remember like little Louis Vega coming into the studio like a couple of years later and saying to the keyboard player, yeah, do that thing like that Mark remix. And I'm like, oh, you're talking about the Been Around the World? Yeah, I love that thing. I'm like, people listen to that? That fucking thing's 11 minutes long. I used 2 reels of tape to make that. There was so much tape on the floor. There was so many edits on that and so many. And, I remember saying because this guy from the record company kind of came in and sort of oversaw the whole thing. And Mark just sat in the back and smoked weed and listened to the radio. Like, because, he had already done his bit. He put this great beat behind it. And the guy from the record label was living out his like DJ booth fantasies of like, let's do a breakdown here and let's do this and just with the strings. So I was, I said, okay, cool. So I kind of did all that. And, but I was shocked and I said, after like editing it all together with this huge pile of tape on the floor, and I said to the guy, Richard Swearet, I'm like, how long do you think this is? He goes, oh, probably about 8 minutes. I said, Mark, how long do you think it is? He goes, oh, I don't know, 6.5 minutes. I'm like, no, it's going to be way longer than that. It was like 11 minutes and something long. So, but, I mean, there's not that many things that I ever did that blew up like out of nothing. Everything was sort of established in a way or just never blew up. I think I had, and we all had bigger. We thought the New Kingdom would have been, bigger than it was, just because in terms of you look back on it, it was just too ahead of its time in a way to have blown up.
Too ahead of its time in terms of the beats or the concepts or.
Kind of all that, and it was a bit of a rock and rap hybrid, and it was just, all the hip hop people thought it wasn't hip hop, and all the rock and pop people thought it was rap, and they didn't want anything to do with it. So, it was just too like in between, which is sort of the story of my career. It's like everything I do is a little bit off center, like even the new record that. It's going out to the jazz press, and some of them totally get it, and some people just don't get it at all. And the Harriet Tubman record that came out just recently, the guy at the label said to me, he said, well, yeah, I don't know what all these jazz people are going to think of this. And I was just like, who cares? But that's a great record. So I've never really been good at predicting what's big or I have no interest in that, really.
Yeah. I guess with what you're doing, though, it's kind of to a point that you made earlier, I think people aren't so, like, in their single genre lanes now because everyone's a hybrid influencer. Being able to do things that are avant-garde, but they've got such a hip-hop sensibility to them. I don't know if sensibility is the right word. A hip-hop flavour to them, just like the dirty, crunchy drums and things like that, like sonically and stuff. It's kind of, I think it's nice to have that kind of cross appeal.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, but it's still, when things are sort of mutated like that, they still don't fit into a category that A&R people or media people or a lot of people. I think that the audience and the people who appreciate music and who listen to music they're far more open-minded and interested in things than the people who sell music and market music give them credit for.
Yeah.
But that's pretty typical, I think.
Yeah. I know you mentioned before that you've had situations where you've been quizzed for quite a long time just about Wu-Tang. But it'd be remiss of me not to bring up Gravediggaz.
Well, either one, yeah. Well, Gravediggaz is where it started for me.
Yeah. So have you worked with Wu-Tang more after that then? Was that a start of a relationship?
Yeah, that's how my relationship with RZA started. He
Yeah.
he was basically, I mean, and Paul had put the Gravediggaz together, and they were all kind of Tommy Boy rejects or misfits or whatever you want to call them.
Right.
Prince Rakeem, he had done a couple of singles, and then Too Poetic had done a couple of singles, and then Fruquan had been in Stetson, and Paul had been in Stetsasonic, and Paul's had been with, and with De La and stuff as well. And he was going through a very dark period in his life and just wanted to sort of vent a little bit. And so he put this group together, and they came up with the whole concept of resurrection and coming back from the dead, or Gravediggaz. The whole thing kind of started a lot of trends. And that's how I met
Yeah.
RZA. That's how I met RZA. I mean, the first record, the core of it is just all stuff that Paul did on his 8-track at home with those guys in his basement. We transferred that stuff to 2-inch and finished the record that way. And then, a lot of the other stuff was just kind of filler to me, or just came later. But I think of like Suicide and um, what's Arm to the Leg. There's a couple. There's about 5 songs that were from the original demo that to me were really the
Right.
essence of that record. And yeah, so then I met RZA, and he hired me to do. I think the first thing I did with him was a remix for "Can It Be All So Simple." That was one
Right.
of those, like, waiting around at the studio for 8 hours for them to show up, and then they finally show up, and then I can't remember if I did another couple of things with them. And I recorded and mixed some of the stuff that he produced on the Gravedigger record. And then he asked me to do the Wu-Tang Forever record, and I went out to LA to do that. But in conjunction with mixing the second Gravedigger record, it kind of started out like basically in between the first record and the second record. Wu-Tang just became huge, and John Baker, who's the head of G Street, became kind of enamored with RZA and gave him the whole budget for the second Gravedigger
Yeah.
record. And Paul didn't really have much to do with that. It was all mostly RZA's students, kind of guys from his camp, did all the beats. And this guy, Carlos Bess, who had recorded and mixed most of 36 Chambers, did most of that record. I didn't record any of it. And,
Yeah. Yeah.
they just asked me. I think it was RZA that asked me, not the label G Street, although I did a lot of work for them, because it was the same label that New Kingdom was on, and I started my relationship with them when I did that Stereo MCs record I talked about earlier. So anyway, yeah, RZA asked me. I was actually in LA, and he said, "Can you come out to LA to mix the Gravedigger record?" And then where I'm trying to finish the Wu-Tang record, and I want to get everybody out of New York so they can focus on finishing this record, because it was 6 months overdue or something. So I said, "Well, I'm actually already in LA." He goes, "Well, I'll call you back in a couple of days." And like 2 weeks later, I still hadn't heard from him. I'm like, "Well, what the fuck, man? I need to either get back to New York or do this record." And then just like I was on the verge of bouncing, and then he called me. He goes, "Okay, we're starting in 2 days." I'm like, "Okay, well, I'm still in LA." So, so that's how that happened. I mean, I started out mixing the Gravedigger record. Just I had the tapes, and Carlos was there, and they stuck us in a little suite together at this place, residential hotel place in LA, and I mixed for a week, the first 6 days or whatever. I think we worked Monday to Saturday and then had one day off a week. And I mixed 5 songs, probably, maybe 6 in that first week. And I don't think Paul was even there. So I just mixed those songs, and then the following month, and Carlos had he just had Triumph up for a week. I just heard it every time I opened the door. It was just blasting. But I can't remember if they maybe didn't have all the vocals on it anyway. He worked on that song. I don't even know if he ended up mixing it by the end of the week, but just sort of working on one song all week and waiting for people to show up and people drifting in and out. And I got maybe half or a third of the Gravedigger record mixed in the first week. And he goes, oh, well, there's a couple of songs. I think he produced a track, and he goes, there's a couple of songs I really want to mix, and I produced this one beat. I'm like, yeah, man, why don't you mix those tomorrow, and I'll work with Wu-Tang. And so he said, okay, great. And so I go in, because we were in this Ray Parker Jr.'s studio in the Valley in LA, and it had two identical SSL rooms with a giant lounge in between. And I guess RZA saw that and he thought, great, I can just be working in two studios and bouncing. And that's the way he is, just doing a million things at once. And it's big enough lounge for the whole crew. And, the slightly smaller crew, hopefully, because it'll just be the band. Because in New York, each guy would show up with 6 guys. So you'd have 18 people in the control room. And I was kind of used to that from the hip hop days and Ultramagnetic and stuff, where it just be a gang of people, and people how can you possibly work with all these people around? I'm like, I'm just kind of used to it. And, there would be years later, I'd be in the middle of doing something and someone would be talking to me, and then finally they'd start yelling at me, and I'm like, oh, what? They're like, oh, I just thought maybe you could do this, or I don't know, we're going to order food or something, whatever. And they're like, didn't you hear me? And I'm like, I just block everything. I'm just been so used to having a million people around when I'm trying to mix something that I just block everything out. I'm just focused on the music. So so that became this weird affliction I had for many years. I probably still do have it. And so, and then the first guy drifts in we get there at 2:00 in the afternoon. The first guy drifts into the studio around 5 and looks at me in the Wu-Tang room, and he's like, where's Carlos? And I'm like, oh, he's working with the Gravediggaz this week. Oh, okay. And then they'd leave and go bug Carlos or whatever. And about 4 or 5 people came in and did the same thing. Where's Carlos? I'm like, he's over there. Finally, RZA comes in. He's like, what are you doing in here? I said, well, Carlos wanted to mix some Gravedigger shit, so I thought, he could do that, and I just sit here, work with you guys. And he's like, I never told you to do that. I'm like, yeah, no, you didn't. You didn't tell me to do that. And then he just kind of looked at me, gave me that sort of cross-eyed stare, and then he just turned around and walked out, and we never talked about it again. But I mean, he was definitely in charge. That's I guess I, was out of my element, making that executive decision for that. But
everyone does these things,
right? He didn't fire me. And then I hadn't worked with him for years, and then I worked with him again during the pandemic on a couple of things. And he actually asked me to work on his second season of his TV series, but I had some health issues and stuff at the time, and I wasn't able to do that. And then I haven't heard from him since. So, easy come, easy go. But I mean, it wasn't like I was sitting around waiting for him to call me back or anything about it. That I was well into my sort of career by then, or whatever.
Yeah. So just going back to that first Gravediggaz album then, I think I was talking to a friend about it the other day when we were going through things, and it's really just kind of in its own lane, and like you say, it influenced a lot of things, and it was just so spooky and eerie. Did you have anything to do with that sound? Was there anything in your mixing and stuff that made it extra gravediggery?
Well, I think I've always been kind of heavy. I've always mixed things very heavy, very lot of bottom end and just kind of heavy. So, I mean, I had this one assistant at Green Street who he assisted me on I guess the first or second New Kingdom record. And he was always say, "You are so dark." And I've always even said that, like I played him stuff and he goes, "This is really dark." And I'm like, yeah, maybe. I mean, it's weird, but I'm a pretty lighthearted guy, so I'm not, I don't, but yeah, just the heaviness of it. But that, like I said, that record was, a lot of it. Paul really conceived that first record, and that was his concept. And he he didn't really tell me very much. I mean, he just let me mix it, and even it was pretty obvious how it should go, really. Whether or not it's has a particular Scotty Hard sound to it or not, I don't really know.
Yeah. I mean, because thinking about the other stuff of yours that I've been listening through, there is kind of a certain, I guess, darkness and rawness to it all. So that does make sense.
Yeah, I mean, I always try to keep things. I always try to keep things kind of raw. I mean, to me, hip hop should be kind of raw and dirty, and I don't make very many clean, slick records. I mean, I've made a few, but for the most part, nobody's calling me for that.
Yeah, yeah. What's it like as an experience as an engineer when you're mixing things that you've not recorded? Because then you've not got, I guess when you're recording, you'll kind of mic things in certain ways and you'll be trying to get certain things out of the instruments or whatever or the mics and things like that. Is it frustrating if you get things where you think, why has it been recorded like this?
Yeah, it can be annoying, but that's really kind of part of the deal or the way it goes. Like, I mean, this session I did on Sunday, I was just basically, well, I set up drums, and the guy said he's going to come in and play drums, and his buddy's going to play some other instruments, and he's going to, do you have this and that and keyboards? And I said to this sort of a young assistant, not or almost like an intern who's learning, and I said, well, this might seem like an excessive amount of mics, but I don't really know what they're going to do with this. So I've got a bunch of options for, what they might want to do when they mix it. I said, if I was mixing this, if I was recording this, even when I record stuff myself, it's always pretty flat and pretty dry, but if I am working with somebody and they said, we want a super trashy drum sound and this and this, and the whole song's going to go like that, or how the song is, I might put up 3 mics and mic the drums like that. But when you don't know what's going on, or even if it's a record that I'm making, and generally, even if I'm recording it from the demos to the tracking to the overdub, I always leave myself a lot of room when I record things, because so many things could change the sort of direction that you might want to go to when you're mixing, because when you're tracking something, it's usually very basic, and then it's like, well, I know I'm going to add strings to this, or I'm going to add piano, I'm going to add horns, or I'm going to add this. So those will change the sort of timbre of the whole, or the outlet, the outlook of the whole thing, or the singer might change the lyrics, or any number of things can change. And with modern recording, you can just put up 12 mics on the drums, and in some ways it's stupid, but it's not really. You can record that many tracks easily, whereas back in the days with 16 track, you sure as hell couldn't put the drums on 12 tracks or even 8 tracks. You'd have to, if on 16 track or 8 track less, or even 24 track. Generally, on 24 track recording, maybe you'd use 8 tracks for the drums. That would be plenty. That would be quite a lot. But you couldn't really, depending on the kind of band it was, but most bands, you know, if you're going to be 8 tracks on the drums, you're going to probably have at least 1 channel for the bass, maybe 2. You know, a lot of times even 1 guitar part will have 2 tracks because they'll use 2 mics or 2 amps, you know. So, I mean, I've gotten, you know, things with people with like 16 channels of guitar. And it's like you wade through it after somebody's sent it to you and you're like, oh, okay, well, I don't need these distant room mics, or I don't need this mic, or I don't need that. So you just start knowing after the second song, well, this is bullshit. I'm not using that. Or you might be like, oh, I'm going to go and use that weird mic that I didn't use on any of the other songs on the breakdown, on the guitar, on the outro or the intro, you know, so you've got all these options. So you have to just kind of parse things down as you look at them and make decisions about that. And sometimes it's up to you to make those decisions, and sometimes, very rarely, a producer will be like, "Oh, don't use those mics," or "Don't do this." I mean, they're hiring you to administer that stuff.
Yeah. So when you were like kind of going through the 90s, you were doing a lot in the realms of hip hop. Were you doing much in the jazz world at that point, or did that kind of come later and like reboot itself with the Medeski Martin Wood stuff?
No, I've been doing some jazz records before that. You know, I did a guy I went to music school with who, you know, was fairly. He's an amazing sax player named Michael Blake, and he was playing in the Lounge Lizards in the early 90s. I was actually at a gig of his at this club called Nell's, and we were sitting there in a break, and I'm like, hey, man, John Lurie's there at the bar checking you out. You should go talk to him. He goes, oh, really? And I'm like, yeah, he's right there. I saw him staring at you. And Lurie told me many years later, he goes, you got him the gig. I never would have gone up and talked to him. But so I had done a record with Michael Blake, and they ended up getting Teo Macero to produce that. And that's why I put on the list, I put that Vernon Reid record, and I put Teo Macero in brackets because that's when I first met Teo. And then soon after that, it's sort of a jazz record. And Teo then signed on to do this record with Michael. And then that was the beginning of my relationship with him for many years. And I mean, he's kind of do you know who he is?
No.
Oh, yeah. See, that's the thing is like people often ask you, who have you worked with? And you say someone, a legend like Teo Macero, and people haven't heard of him, and you're like, oh, okay. But no, he produced Bitches Brew by Miles Davis, and
oh, wow.
and all the 60s jazz stuff. And he was kind of like, you know, it's not really a mentor of mine, but I learned a lot from him just listening to all the records he made, because he was a very hands-on producer and did a lot of production, a lot of composition and arrangements in the studio, which is kind of what I do, you know, and that led to the working with MMW and Sex Mob came. I think I did the Sex Mob record before I did the first MMW record, and Steven Bernstein, the leader of Sex Mob, was in the lounges with Michael Blake, and that's where I first met him. Michael brought him to a session. Paul was producing this guy named Justin Warfield, and
right.
And he brought Bernstein, and I met That's how I met Bernstein, and then one thing led to another, and he just wanted to do something totally different, and I did the first Sex Mob record, and that kind of got the ball rolling on all the jazz, pseudo jazz, downtown jazz, all that stuff. Producing DJ Logic and
Justin Warfield was produced by Quincy's son, wasn't he? QD3.
I think the very first song he did was produced by Q, and the record that we did was for that label, QD or Quest. I think it was called QWEST, and it was called. I think it was called My Plan. My something plan from Space Nine, Plan
My
9
Field Trip
from
to Planet 9.
That's it.
Oh,
so
right.
Paul,
yeah.
Paul produced that record, and I recorded and mixed that record, and
right.
And Paul said we need horns on something, so I just called Michael and I said we need 2 horns. Bring a trumpet player. Here's the studio address, and he walked in with Bernstein. And we just became more and more attached, to the point where the last Sex Mob record was basically a collaboration between Steven and I. I wrote the bed tracks, and then he wrote the melodies, and the band came in and played them, and then I took the recordings and did more stuff to them and mixed them, and then that became The Hard Way, which was the last Sex Mob record. And then this new record, everyone's like, oh, is it like The Hard Way? And I'm like, well, no, it's exactly the opposite. The Hard Way, I gave him the music and he wrote the melodies. This one, he gave me all the source material and said, just make something new out of this. So that was kind of like a reimagining of that record. I took fragments of different songs and put them together, and
and that's come out that's a double album, isn't it? So you've got Ultra Resonance, which is your side, and the Resonation Trio, which is like the main album,
yeah, or it's the genesis of the whole thing. And he describes it as kind of like his hearing Garvey's Ghost by Burning Spear, and not thinking it was the trippiest record he'd ever heard. He didn't realize that it was a remix record or a dub record. And he's like, well, what if you could do that with jazz, with the acoustic jazz? So, he didn't even really articulate that to me till I was, 6 months in. And, he kept saying, I love this. This is great. I've been wanting to make a record like this for 30 years. So, that's a pretty good bit of encouragement when you're making a record. But that was a very difficult record to make because it was completely, people say, oh, just do whatever you want, or you could, that is so, it usually ends up being a real curse because you do whatever you want, and then they're like, oh yeah, but I wasn't thinking it would be like that. I'm like, well, you said do whatever you want, but it was also completely uncharted territory. It's like, who's ever done a record like that? Like I've done a million records where I chop everything up in Pro Tools and rearrange it, but this was this was completely different, and I wanted to do it differently. So I ended up using some different samplers and some different recording techniques and different devices, different software and stuff, just to take myself out of my own comfort zone to create something entirely new. But it took me a long time to get my head around it and to sort of figure out how to do it. And then once I got into it and kind of started to forget what song the bass line came from and where I grabbed the melody from and how I put the drums together, they, by the end, everything was a total mishmash. There's a couple of songs where the bass, drums, and trumpet are I think there's 2 songs where the bass, drums, and the trumpet are from the same song, and I just reworked them. But I changed the time signature and often changed the key and did all kinds of different stuff. And I was really gratified. They had their record release party the other night, and at the beginning I was like, oh, the bass player's going to hate this record, what I've chopped his drum bass up into. And they were both like, dude, man, the record's incredible, I love the record. So it's and those guys are way above average in terms of artistry. So to have people
Yeah.
like that give you props, that's really that's what it's all about, to me.
Yeah, it must be really interesting using that, like those hip hop um, techniques and processes, but with things like you say, where you're not just where you're flipping time signatures and things like that, and using really complex source material in that sort of way, rather than using it to build very sort of repeated loops.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's definitely, I mean, my compositional style and production style is definitely has its roots in basic hip hop production for sure. Like in terms of like often just starting and creating a beat and then just starting to add things on top of that. And when we did The Hard Way, Steven had come to the record release party for my record, The Science of Sesh, and he's like, "Oh, I love this record. It's so cool." And I'm like, "Well, why don't we do a Sex Mob, like a process record, like with Sex Mob, and I'll make some tracks, and we'll just do it like that." I said, "We've done the four guys in a room thing enough times. Like, let's do something totally different." And he was, I mean, that's the thing. This great thing about working with him is he's game for anything. So a lot of musicians are
Mm.
very stuck in the music world, whereas he conceives of things more sonically and understands things on that level. And certain other guys I've worked with, Medeski's like that too, and Vijay. Like a lot of these, but a lot of jazz musicians or musicians in general are very like, oh, that's out of time or that's in the wrong key or something. It's like, I
Yeah.
mean, I'm a trained musician, but I ever, if I'm got and I've made a loop of something or I've done something, I'm like, oh, I better figure out what key this is in. Like I never do that. I just do
Right.
everything by ear, do everything by ear.
Right. Um. So we've not talked a lot about Carr. But like you mentioned, you've had had a long relationship with him.
Yeah, I met Ka through DJ Preservation, who I met through Mike Ladd, and I, I'd known Jean for quite a long time and worked with him. He was Most Def's DJ for a while, and I mixed a couple of songs, Most Def songs for him. And then, he called me one day and said, "I've got this new project that I'm doing with this MC named Ka, and we want you to mix it." So that was the beginning, was the days of Dr. Yen Lo, and that's when I started with him. And I remember right at the near the beginning, they were both there when I'm mixing, and I guess we printed the first song. I'm like, "Do you want me to?" And that, I don't know if you know that particular record, but it's got um, a lot of samples, audio samples from the movie The Manchurian Candidate, the Frank Sinatra movie, and a lot of the narrative is kind of built around those little audio clips. And I said, "Should I do a version without the movie stuff?" And Carl's like, "Why would you do that? Why the fuck would you do that, man? I'm never gonna. We don't need to do that." And I'm like, okay, just like sort of standard thing with hip hop records is, you do you do a main mix and a TV mix and then a cappella mix and an instrumental mix and maybe one without the sound effects. And he's like, "No, this is my art, man. I don't need, you know." Because at that point, he was working for the fire department, and his music was his art and what he did on the side, and he completely didn't compromise anything when he was doing his music.
Mm.
Amazing guy, amazing person, amazing, one of the greatest rappers I ever worked with, without a doubt, and just a very, very special person. And it was a very, very sad day when I got that phone call, because he was like a
Yeah.
Superman. Like he was a guy that walked out of burning buildings with babies in his arms. Like this guy was, and he was like the most in shape, healthy guy I knew. I'm like, so, how could he die? But he did, and, but I cherished, working with him for sure. He was a great guy, and he always paid in cash. He'd come in with a huge wad of money. He goes, "Man, nothing makes me happier, Scotty, than just handing you this roll of money." I'm like, "Great, makes me pretty happy too."
Right. I just want to check we've got no American tax officials listening. I'm assuming not, so I think we'll be good.
I declared that on my income tax. Don't worry.
So with Carr's work that I've been listening to, because I didn't really know anything about him. He's written about very kind of fondly in a book that I read all about sort of 90s to 90s hip hop. But
really,
yeah, it's Ben Pedroche's book. I've had him on here. Yeah, I'll find it for you. But listening back, there's a lot of quite kind of sparse, drumless stuff going on.
yeah.
Was he kind of early doing that? Because you've got like Rock Marciano, Griselda, and a whole host of other people since that have done that. Like a lot of the Alchemist production has gone down that sort of route. Was Carr sort of influential?
Yes, I would say so. I mean, those guys were all in his camp for sure. I mean, Rock is the only guy that he ever really collaborated with. They had a group called Metal, I think it was called. And Rock, but Carl would never, like, people would, a couple people called me up and were like, "Oh, I see you've been working with Carl. I love him. Can you get him to be on my track?" I'm like, "No." And they're like, "No, can you just ask him?" I'm like, "No, I'm not going to even ask him because he will say flat out refuse to do that. He does not do features." But the only person he ever did it with was with Rock on Rock's records, and I think he did. Our friend Sage just put out a record, and his goes by Navy Blue, and Cause on that posthumously. And yeah, he was one of the first guys. I mean, Jean, the guy from DJ Preservation, he did a lot of very sparse drum kind of stuff. So that's why I think Ka picked up on him and his production style because they are very similar. And I remember somebody asking, I would start working with him like, "Yeah, this guy's incredible." And they're like, "Well, what does it sound like?" And I said, "Well, it kind of sounds like the intro to a Wu-Tang Clan before the drums come in, but the drums never come in."
Mm.
And I said to Carl once, I said, "Well, you would have been a fucking great drummer, man, because your timing is superlative." Like he didn't need drums. His flow was so rhythmic, yet it kind of floated over the top of the beats in a way that was that connected with the music, but also was kind of just hovering above it in a way that had its own kind of rhythmic integrity. And I remember he was telling me some German guy like did a remix of his, and he just laughed and he said, "How could you possibly remix me? You can't remix me because I'm like not on a grid. I'm not, my shit is not remix. It's unremixable."
Mm.
I was like, "Oh, that's an interesting perspective," but is definitely, he was very adamant about the production being that way. Plus, like
Yeah.
he kind of took over his own production for the most part. I mean, we did one record called The Hermit and the Recluse and it was the guy who's kind of Rock Marcy's DJ, this guy, Animos, he goes by. He did some production with Ka, but Ka, he didn't, he was just putting these tracks together more like a DJ style where they were just two track. They were always just two tracks. and there was no additional overdubs of anything. On the Yen Lo record, like Jean added a few little stabs and a few little 808s here and there, but for the most part, it was very sparse and just 2-track, kind of like DJ style production with 2
Yeah.
tracks. Whereas my style of production is the exact opposite of that, and using little bits to create something, rather than taking an entire thing. And that was the thing that was genius about the way Cobb produced tracks, is he would just find these really interesting bits. And I remember calling him up one day because I had just started working with the MPC again, and he used the MPC 2500, and I had one as well. And I was like trying to figure something simple out, like just saving a tempo or making a song form or something. And I'm like, hey, man, we would talk from time to time. And I was just like, hey, oh, yeah, by the way, how do you do XYZ on the MPC? It was a very basic question that, I could have just Googled it. But I just thought, I was already talking to him. I asked him, he goes, oh, I don't know, Scotty, man, that's above my pay grade. And I'm like, what? And he said, yeah, no, I don't know how to do that. I'm like, you don't know how to do that? And you've been working with this machine for 6, 7, 8 years? He goes, no, man, I don't do that. And then my assistant, who was my assistant for a long time, moved to LA, and Kyle was living in LA a lot. And he called me and he said, oh, my regular engineer has moved. Do you have a guy out here? And I'm like, yeah, you should get Connor. And Connor told me, like, he would come in to do the vocals, and he would bring his MPC and start it up and load the samples in, and then take a notebook out and find the tempo, and he would reprogram every song. Like, he never saved anything as a song. So he would drop all the music down, basically reprogram all this stuff, 10 songs or whatever it was, and then do these epic, and the same night, do these epic vocal sessions and do vocals till like 6 o'clock in the morning. Which I'm like, yeah, well, you don't call me to do that, because I'm not working. I don't do 12-hour shifts. I used to work 14 hours a day for 15, almost 20 years. I don't do that anymore, but because of there's a lot of reasons why I don't do that. But age not being the primary one, more like, just my disability and stuff. But anyway, that's pretty amazing that he would just basically like reprogram everything. Like, it's like, dude, you could just save it with the samples. So, like, the guy was incredible. I got this right here.
Oh, nice.
That was from the Legacy open studio from last summer. And they're doing another one this year too, where like his wife, she reprinted some of the records on vinyl, and just a gathering of the community of people that are from around the world. Like, people came from everywhere last year. I mean, the first night was just sort of family, and we were all there, and we took pictures and stuff and talked about Ka, and because, and it was a celebration of life. Whereas, like, his memorial was fucking heavy, and like, the fire trucks pulled up, and the 21 gun salute or whatever, and all the bagpipes going, and it was super emotional and really, really, really heavy. So to have done that last summer, that Mimi put this thing together where we could all kind of come together and just be very joyous about it, was a real blessing, and it's very healing to those of us in his family, because he meant a lot to a lot of people.
Yeah. You just mentioned before about your disability. I've listened to that podcast about your accident, but I'd be quite interested in knowing if you could kind of sort of top level, because from what I listened to, you were basically involved in a car accident. I can't remember exactly when, but what struck me with it was you mentioned on there about the way that you were rolled by the ambulance, like by the response crew, because they thought, oh well, his spine's done, basically. So there is a chance that accident didn't have to be as bad as it was in terms of your injuries. So I wonder how that feels and how you kind of make peace with something like that, and also how do you adjust, and what's the level of disability you've had to get used to, and how's it impacted your work?
Well, I mean, they probably weren't entirely wrong that the deed was done. I had been thrown across the car and uh, ended up on my knees and broke my back and stuff. Yeah, they did just manhandle me and haul me out of the car, and it could have been the difference between my having a what they call a complete spinal cord injury and an incomplete spinal injury. And when they say complete, it means that the spinal cord's been severed, and it's possible that it was an incomplete injury, and then they made it worse by pulling me out of the car. It's hard to know. I mean, I immediately couldn't feel my legs, though. So, a significant amount of the damage was done on impact, basically. I was leaving my studio at about 2:30 in the morning, and I was going to meet a friend of mine at my friend's bar, and he was DJing, and we were going to go talk about this project. And I was 2 blocks away from the studio, and we got sideswiped by a car, T-boned, as they say. And I was sitting in the back seat, passenger side, and I got thrown across. I think the car spun around a few times, and I got thrown across to the other side and ended up on my knees on the floor of the car with my back kind of hyperextended, leaning against the back seat. So I was kneeling on the floor of the back seat. And I mean, I was definitely angry for a number of years, and going to therapy and helped with that. But pretty much when something like that happens to you, there's not much you can do about it. It's the damage has been done, and you just have to live with that and reconcile that. And the people who did it to me, the guy, they lied in court, and they're just really hideous, awful people. And so I have no love for them, and I certainly have no forgiveness for them. And we had a lawsuit that I didn't really end up walking away with very much from. And I'm a T5 complete spinal cord, T5 complete spinal cord injury. So I'm paralyzed from my upper chest down. So obviously I can't move my legs. And it's about an inch high. If it had been an inch higher, I'd be a quadriplegic. But I mean, I kind of opened my eyes after the impact, and I couldn't feel my legs, but I kind of went like this, and like, oh, my hands still work. I can still play the guitar. But which as it turns out, is considerably more difficult than I would like. It's very frustrating because my balance is so off. It's very difficult for me to. I was playing bass in the studio a couple of weeks ago, and 16 bars into the punch in, I just sort of like fall over and then have to kind of pull myself back up. So, makes that kind of stuff very difficult. And, I have to get, it's very frustrating. Like someone says, oh, let's go out for dinner. And I'm like, where are we going? And they're like, oh, I was thinking of going here. And I'm like, okay, let me call the place and find out. And they're like, oh, we're wheelchair accessible. Or wheelchair accessible? What? Or I think we are. I'm like, if you only think you are, I don't think I'm coming there. Or even like places say that we definitely are. I went to a place about a month ago and I was able to get in and everything with a little bit of help because the ramp was so steep. And then I went to use the restroom, which they told me definitely was wheelchair accessible. And it wasn't. Like, I said, well, I can get my wheelchair in there, but I can't close the door. So, and I took the manager aside and said, are you the manager? Yeah. I said, yeah. So I called here and they said that your bathroom's wheelchair accessible, and it definitely isn't. So just wanted to let you know that for future. So, and he goes, oh, well, I'll talk to them about it. I said, yeah, I mean, all you need to do is turn the hinges around and have the door open outwards instead of inwards. And it'll, but there's so many of these things people just don't think about. And I mean, I didn't think about them and my friends didn't think about them until somebody within your direct hemisphere becomes disabled. And then it's all, people think about it all the time. People be like, Scotty, I was at this great opening at blah blah museum and you should go see it. It's definitely accessible and I thought about you. And so it's constantly a challenge. Even after 18 years I'm still figuring out ways to make it work. Like for instance, the place I live in now, I lived in a one-room apartment in sort of public housing for 13 years while I kind of waited for this settlement to happen. And it was a place that I could afford to live. And then I was able to resolve everything and thought that I would come away after all this and after everything had done to have enough money to buy an apartment that I could retrofit for a wheelchair and stuff. And I didn't even get that much money. So I basically still renting, but it took me 13 months to find a place that was wheelchair accessible and that I didn't have to like spend a fortune modifying and stuff. Cause I'd find apartments and they had an elevator in them, but there'd be 4 steps into the building. And it's like, well, that doesn't make very much sense. So there's constantly things going on that you have to deal with that you have to do to survive, kind of. But, I still, making music and making, I think, as good or better music than I've ever made. So it hasn't stopped me in that respect.
Yeah, that's awesome. Just a couple of more things then before we go. I've just got a couple of little sort of spot questions. We've probably been over this, but are there any weird or surprising mic choices for rappers? Because, I mean, sometimes you'll listen to some hip-hop and you think, why have they used that mic? It just doesn't seem to bring the most out of their voice, but is there any that have surprised you?
Well, this guy that I was, on my first record, and he was part of the Word Sound crew, his name was Sensational, and he first came up with the Jungle Brothers, and he made his first record was called Loaded with Power, and it's a fucking great record, and he made it all with like a 4-track and like a super rudimentary sampler and stuff, and all the vocals were done with headphones through a DJ mixer, the old DJ trick where you plug the headphones into the mic input and then and it, it's like, to me, like, that was the dopest record that he ever made, and the vocals sounded fucking great on that record. Whereas, when his voice was pristine and perfect, it just didn't have the same quality to it. And like when I was working with, when I first started working with Makami, he recorded his vocals at home and they are all totally distorted. But I'm like, okay, well, that's the way they are. Let's work with that and go with that. And he loved that. He was like, man, you're the first engineer who didn't like tell me to redo the vocals. And I'm like, well, they are what they are, and they've got a vibe to them. So like, who am I to say that? I'm just making the best of what we've got here and trying to lean into it rather than fight against it. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but
yeah. And the other thing I wanted to ask you, we're actually in the process of putting together a beat tape where a load of people have sampled Bo Hansen. So it's a little project just in the community of the podcast. And, everyone's sort of mixing, got different processes and stuff. Some people are in the box, some people are in the DAW. Say if you're working in a DAW and you've kind of bootstrapped your setup, so you've got whatever sort of sound card, laptop, you've got your DAW, that maybe you've got something that comes free, maybe you've got, let's call it a sample version, trial version, and then you've got, I don't know, say a few $100 to buy one piece of outboard kit for beat making. Is there one specific thing you would recommend someone buy as outboard to really just enhance, say like a compressor or whatever, something that can really just enhance the sound of what you're doing?
Well, probably not a compressor because, unless you know what you're doing, you can really make a mess of things with a compressor. But a lot of times people come to me and they say, and I always just say, there's this one particular, I have two of them, one at my home and one at my house, which is an old piece of gear that they don't make anymore. And it's a mic pre. It costs a little bit more than a couple $100. I think my friend Connor got one for $800 at one point. But it's a mic pre EQ, and that's something that would enhance the vocal recording for sure. Having a good mic pre with a mic, even with a 57 or a 58, running it through a better mic pre sounds a lot better. And then you've got a really comprehensive parametric EQ that you can use to EQ your vocals, but also to run everything in your mix through, or you record your beats through that or whatever. You've got a really good. So I would say, like, if you were just going to buy one thing, if you've already got a microphone, to get a better mic pre that has a good EQ in it, and that's the way to start. And other than that, like a better microphone is always and not a bad idea as well. But there's a lot of plugins that do so many things. Like in terms of compressors, you're better off using a plug-in compressor than a cheap analog compressor,
Right.
I mean, there are certain compressors like that are really trashy and really kind of cool, but that wouldn't really serve you well on very many things besides something very trashy,
Yeah.
And the other thing that I would say that in terms of not anything hardware or analog, but on the last record I used the guys at Serato gave me their new plugin called Serato Sample, and that made doing ultra resonance, so much easier. I started out doing after about the first or second song, using many different things, and I'd used a lot of I'd used outboard samplers as well, but just being able to, and I used a 404 and my 950 and stuff as well, but just in terms of creating a more efficient flow for sampling and resampling and changing things around, that was a lifesaver. It's brilliant. And that's pretty cheap. I mean, I think it's $150 or something like that. And that was a very powerful thing. I mean, they also have a thing called Serato Studio, which I didn't really use because I already kind of have all that stuff, but that's kind of its own little DAW. But I mean, the stuff that they're making is really pretty powerful.
Nice. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, it's really good.
Amazing.
It's worth it.
Yeah. And speaking of plugs, do you want to do one more plug for the album before we close out?
Sure. Well, yeah, the record just came out. It's called Ultra Resonance. And on streaming, it's Scotty Hard and Steven Bernstein's Ultra Resonance. It's a separate record. And then the companion record is called Resonation Trio. And then as a CD or vinyl, it's a single package. As a double album and a single CD, and you get both albums. The acoustic trio record is the first on the CD. It's the first thing, and then the my version, Ultra Resonance, comes next.
Amazing. Well, yeah, that's been really good, Scotty. Really enjoyed that and learnt a lot from it. So yeah, that's Ultra Resonance by Scotty Hard and Steve Bernstein, and yeah, check it out. If you like jazz, if you like something a bit crazy but like the hip-hop sensibility, then it's definitely worth a listen. And yeah, thanks very much for that, Scotty, and all the best with everything in the future.
Thanks for having me, Adam. I really appreciate it. Enjoyed talking to you.
Take care. If you've enjoyed this episode of Paths of Rhythm, please can you like, subscribe, share, do anything you can to help grow the show, as it'll help me to keep getting more great guests and more great conversations out there. Paths of Rhythm is a remote CTRL production, which is my day-to-day business, specialising in audio and video production, podcasts, webinars, all that sort of good stuff, largely in the B2B space. To find out more about what we do, head to remote-ctrl.co.uk. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back with you soon.